All right. Yeah, I have a music stand that I use to read from, and it's a lot easier than holding the book in my hand. So here we go again. Benjamin Franklin sailed to England in the spring of 1757, arriving in July. He was the official political representative of the British colony of Pennsylvania, 2 decades before the Americans would declare their independence. When Franklin took up residence there, Great Britain was very backward. Protective tariffs and other strict trade regulations in place since the time of Queen Elizabeth I had earlier brought craft industries into existence, but there had been no transformative economic strategy for many generations. There were almost no roads between cities, no canals or railroads. Iron, cloth, or grain could be shipped overland only in the saddlebags of a pack horse, and only when there was little mud. Local operatives or rural families produced small batches of goods. Some in London were wealthy from empire and finance, but the city was the capital of an undeveloped country. The project to industrialize Britain began shortly after Franklin's arrival, initiated by a small circle of his collaborators and co thinkers. It would be carried to fruition under his inspiration and coaching until the imperial rulers drove him from the country at the outbreak of the American Revolution. This was Franklin's second trip to England. He had visited the mother country as an 18-year-old, perhaps to gather intelligence for the progress minded political leaders of the colonies. Now aged 51 years, Franklin personified the hopes of the world for a new renaissance, like that of the 15th and 16th centuries. His published experiments had clarified the nature of electricity and had advanced confidence in man's ability to control nature. He had set up in Philadelphia what was called a junto, a secretly organized group of his proteges and friends committed to philosophical and scientific inquiry. Members pledged to start new such groups without revealing the originating center. Franklin's junto became in 1743 the unsecretive American Philosophical Society, the first organization uniting the colonies. Its subcommittees planned industries for America, even though Parliament had declared such basic industries as iron manufacturing to be illegal in the American colonies. As colonial postmaster, Franklin had regularized communication within British America. Inexpensive newspapers, including his own publications, now brought up to date political intelligence within the reach of all colonial readers. Corresponding with a worldwide circle of sympathetic leaders in science, art, religion, politics, and the military, Franklin was chief of intelligence for an American nation then in the process of being created. The London oligarchy. The crucial enterprises described in this chapter were not initiated by those controlling Britain's commerce, finance, or government whose minds and talents were elsewhere engaged. The London power center was then in a long war to consolidate British rule over India, to reduce Indians to slavery on imperial plantations, and to take opium from India to addict and subdue China. They had recently vetoed the Massachusetts legislature's resolution to abolish slavery in that colony as dangerous to the British interest. They had imposed the Iron Act, prohibiting American manufacture, and currency laws to prevent credit issuance that would spur American industry. And just make a quick comment about how that resonates with what I observe today in our country, in our economy. We are not allowed to have productive industries. We can't have them. The Green Revolution is preventing us from having them. And the CO2 thing, the climate warming, all that propaganda. Well, as long as the media is behind it, the American people are going to follow that. And therefore, when I go and like to a shopping center or something, Even the new businesses, they're only either a restaurant or personal services like to get your nails done. Uh, there's just there's just not any real industry being allowed by the financial system to grow and to allow us to have our own internal economy that we could tell the rest of the world to, just kiss off because we don't need you anymore. Well, that's the same strategy that was applied by the London oligarchy to keep the colonies in virtual slavery or real slavery. What were these London financiers whose global looting had left most of Britain itself in a feudal backwardness? Who were they? The power of the City of London, this name identifies the financial district within the wider city, had grown up in the 17th century. The East India Company was chartered in 1601 and had a royal monopoly on trade east of Africa's Cape of Good Hope. King Charles II, in partnership with rich city men, started up the Royal African Company. The partners created the slave colony in North America called Carolina, named for the king. They supplied it and other colonies with slaves, kidnapped from West Africa, killing millions in the process and devastating Africa until the present day. These criminal African and Asian ventures were to make the London magnates super rich and give them the means to govern Britain and much of the world in their own interest. The 1688 accession of William III marked the beginning of the modern British regime. The Crown and the City were locked in as partners, controlling policy through the Privy Council and the Parliament, a top-down dictatorship over the British people and over subject peoples of the empire. The Bank of England, chartered 1694, was an instrument of this new arrangement. The combination of the crown, the city, and favored aristocrats with strategists, pet philosophers, and propagandists forms the modern London-based oligarchy. It still now derives the interlocked British apparatus of banks, trading companies, diplomacy, the military, the secret services, universities, and news outlets. Sorry, it still now drives these interlocked institutions. This imperial apparatus was later extended to include New York's Wall Street. Okay, there's Chaitkin, who knows what he's talking about, saying Wall Street is included in the City of London. And we always, I think one of the big struggles that we have right now is so many people are blaming Washington. Washington did this, Washington did that, you know? Or the United States did this, the United States did that. But if we are honest about it, Washington is not doing these things. Wall Street and the great financial powers of Wall Street are controlling the agenda. And to understand that Wall Street is but a part of the City of London is to give us a framework that we can hang other understandings upon. So if we accept, Chaitkin's idea here, then it helps us to understand, who's behind the curtain that's behind the curtain that's behind, the Russian doll. All right, back to the reading. Franklin cultivated relations with powerful, sophisticated city men, typified by Lord Shelburne. We've talked about Lord Shelburne many times, a leading stockholder and strategist of the East India Company, and Sir Francis Dashwood, head of the Hellfire Club and postmaster of the United Kingdom. Yes, the notorious Hellfire Club. These men would tolerate scientific initiatives which could somehow be of use to the empire, but they despised the intentions of the developers to uplift humanity, did not invest in their enterprises, and would crush attempts to extend technical prowess outside of imperial control. There it is again. The ground for Franklin Circle's revolution in England had been prepared before his arrival, particularly by the Reverend John Mitchell, a professor of astronomy, physics, geology, theology, Greek, and Hebrew at Cambridge University. Can you imagine conquering all those fields today? Perhaps they were less developed at that time. Anyway, Franklin attended Cambridge University commencement exercises in 1758. Traveling next to Birmingham, he carried a letter from Mitchell addressed to Matthew Boulton Jr., that's Boulton, a second-generation manufacturer of buckles, buttons, and toys. Quote, to introduce the best philosopher of America, whom you already very well acquainted with, though you don't know him personally, unquote. Beginning immediately that summer of 1758, Franklin and Boulton began joint work together on electricity, metallurgy, and the harnessing of steam power. Their collaboration, at times surreptitious and subject to police surveillance, continued through the American Revolution until Franklin's death in 1790. Franklin became the tutor, science advisor, and political counselor to a select group of Boulton's friends in Birmingham. The potter Josiah Wedgwood, the scientist and poet Erasmus Darwin, Boulton's physician, iron maker John Wilkinson, Joseph Priestley, a political reformer and groundbreaking scientist, most famously James Watt, who would move in from Scotland to join Boulton's enterprise. These men formed the core of what would come to be known long afterward as the Lunar Society. Franklin and his English friends followed his Philadelphia pattern, organizing other interconnected junto-like groupings that shared Franklin's passion for the improvement of the human condition through natural science, industrial inventions, medicine, and civil engineering. Franklin himself would thus become, in that period, a great power within Britain and in Ireland, as in the Irish independence movement. Notwithstanding the ambiguous and increasingly tense relations of Franklin and his friends with the city imperialists. The industrialization of Manchester. The first project of the Franklin Circle was to create a new city with access to cheap fuel. In the process of building Manchester, England's first industrial center, the Franklin Associates would initiate low-cost transportation for all goods, an essential condition for an industrial nation. For these purposes, they would use a young, sympathetic, but not very wealthy Duke of Bridgewater, whose estate came to be managed by the Franklin Circle. John Gilbert, a lifelong intimate of Matthew Boulton Jr., was hired in 1757 as the manager of the Duke of Bridgewater's lands and coal mines at Worsley. John Gilbert's brother, Thomas Gilbert, was already estate manager for the allied Bridgewater and Gower families. In that year of 1757, 21-year-old Francis Egerton, the third Duke of Bridgewater, came into possession of his inheritance, which included both lands in London and the Worsley estate, located in an agricultural area some 10 miles west of the market town of Manchester. John Gilbert convinced the new owner to cut a canal from the coal mines eastward to Manchester. Studying the elevation of the ore and the surrounding land, Gilbert turned the perennial problem of mine flooding into a technologically unprecedented aid to navigation. He proposed that canal digging should begin underground in the mine itself and proceed out through the side of a hill. Newly mined coal could thus be loaded directly onto barges, while the mine's drainage would help maintain water levels in the overland canal. Manchester then had only 6,000 houses and no factories requiring coal as fuel. Wood was used for hearth fires throughout England. There was no market whose logic Bridgewater was obeying when he decided to pursue such a construction project, and there were no other canals in England. But the Duke's imagination had been well prepared for this adventure. He had gone to Europe as a pupil and ward of Robert Wood, who dearly loved the Greek poet Homer and classical civilization. Wood tamed the teenage Duke's carousing and immersed him in the works of Renaissance Christian humanism. He learned engineering and science at the Lyon Academy. He studied Renaissance painting in Rome. The young Duke viewed the canals of Holland and closely inspected the great Languedoc Canal across France. The Languedoc had been surveyed by Leonardo da Vinci, who died in 1519, but it was built by Colbert in the late 1600s using locks designed by Leonardo. Excitedly agreeing to John Gilbert's proposal, Duke Francis devoted his life to the construction of canals. Preparations began secretly with initial purchases of land into Manchester. An act was put through Parliament for the right to compel landowners along the canal to sell Duke Francis their property, eminent domain. The price of coal from the Worsley mines was fixed by law and at no more than 4 shillings per hundredweight, compared to the pre-canal average price of 7 or 8 shillings. Freight tolls were also set by law, and manure for fertilizer was to be carried toll-free on the canal. The Duke was not a, quote, capitalist, but a heavily encumbered landowner. He exhausted his personal funds early in the construction effort. To raise money, the Gilbert brothers sold small denomination bonds to local merchants, while the Duke borrowed from his tenants. No backing came from London banks. Indeed, there was no net profit in the enterprise for some 15 years, though Bridgewater eventually made a large profit on the canal system after decades of labor. Duke Francis routinely paid fair prices to landowners displaced for the canal. He hired many coal miners, paid them good wages, and provided decent living conditions for his workers in new cottages. The canal was begun in 1759 and completed into Manchester in 1761. Thousands of people began moving into the city and starting families there with a secure supply of cheap Worsley coal for warm houses. And there were well-paying jobs. With a new labor supply and cheap fuel, many profitable new manufacturing shops were set up. A greatly expanded canal system and steam-powered machinery would before long complete this amazing, virtually overnight creation of an industrial center. Sounds like something that the Chinese are credited with doing more recently. Well, let me catch my breath for a minute and say hello to the chat room. Hello, Willie Fixit's here. Very good. Win Tai, hello. How are you? Sharon Hobbs is here. Sunshine. And Sergeant Stadenko filling out the. Oh, Prester John is here. Hello, Prester. All right, you guys got a conversation going in the chat room. That's good. I know that when I read, you guys often have a conversation going on, and multitasking is the thing to do these days. So go right ahead, have at it. Let's see. Did I bring you anything from Ireland? I'm going to give you a slideshow real soon. I may get it together by tomorrow, but that's pretty much what I got for you, and a lot of good stories. So we'll have a show about the Ireland trip real soon, Michael Panzer. And no, I didn't bring you a big green leprechaun hat. I know you wanted one, with the shamrocks and the gold and all, but the glitter, I know. But nope, I'm just draw the line right there. Big green leprechaun hats. By 1790, workmen from the new textile mills could be seen walking Manchester streets, 5-pound notes protruding ostentatiously from their hats. Yet, 50 years later, that very city was famed for the horrible poverty and cruelty in its mills, and for the so-called Manchester School of Economic Thought, the radical free trade doctrine, which claimed that the unrestricted freedom to do ill to one's neighbor was the cause of England's technical development. Poverty and misery were falsely blamed on new technology, rather than on the crime of those who had taken over in place of the inventors and built up low-wage places of torture. After the success of the Bridgewater Canal was demonstrated, the entire Bolton-Franklin group swung into action. A partnership of the Gilbert brothers, Josiah Wedgwood, Erasmus Darwin, and Matthew Bolton was formed to extend the canal from Manchester to the port of Liverpool, and then to push on to connect Hull, Bristol, and London. Darwin and Wedgwood's partner, Thomas Bentley, wrote pamphlets in an effort to expand the British people's aspirations toward economic progress. Josiah Wedgwood placed the following newspaper notice, quote, "That great genius and father of his country, Russia's Tsar Peter, being well informed of the extensive utility of inland navigation to the growth of commerce, completed a canal between Petersburg and the Volga at an incredible expense through an uncouth and arduous country. The states of Holland owe their very existence, as well as their opulence and power, to the numerous canals. And the French nation, our rival in arts and arms, have already much availed themselves by navigable cuts of vast extent and of amazing advantage to their commerce. That of Languedoc is a most stupendous work." After feverish negotiations, planning, and lobbying, a bill authorizing the cutting of the Partners' Canal to Liverpool was steered through the Parliament, gaining approval through the House of Commons Commerce Committee, whose chairman was Thomas Gilbert. Meanwhile, Franklin had started up the group on a new project to coordinate the development of a practical steam engine. From London, Franklin wrote to Bolton, quote, "To introduce my friend Dr. William Small to your acquaintance, an ingenious philosopher and a most worthy, honest man. If anything in new magnetism or electricity or any other branch of natural knowledge has occurred to your fruitful genius since I last had the pleasure of seeing you, you will, by communicating it, greatly oblige." William Small, a native Scot, had immigrated to Virginia in 1758 to take a science and mathematics teaching assignment at the College of William and Mary. And I'll just put a personal note in here. As a graduate of William and Mary, William Small's Hall was our science building was named after him, and I remember it well. There, Dr. Small became the close friend of the Platonist law professor George Wythe, or Wythe, Franklin's most important collaborator in the Southern colonies. And another personal note, I was my second job as a law clerk was in the George Wythe Law Building in Alexandria, Virginia. Wythe would take his law students through electrical experiments to demonstrate the moral natural law that underlies any authentic human legislation. Wythe, Small, and their mutual student Thomas Jefferson and Virginia's Governor Francis Fauquier formed a regular string quartet to play classical music. Wythe would be a founding father of the nation, promoting the revolution, writing the rules for the Constitutional Convention, and helping guide Virginia's ratification of the Constitution. We will encounter him in a later chapter as the spiritual and intellectual mentor of Henry Clay, the great 19th century American nationalist leader. Franklin's friendship with Dr. Small probably began in 1763 when Franklin visited Williamsburg Pittsburgh during his brief return from England to America. A hostile administration at the college soon afterward forced Small to leave his post. Small and Franklin went to England in 1764. The following year, Small accepted Dr. Franklin's momentous assignment. On Franklin's recommendation, Bolton instantly accepted William Small as his personal physician and overall industrial manager. Bolton had inherited a buckle-making shop upon his father's death in 1759. He then built what was to become England's first great manufacturing plant, the Soho Works, outside Birmingham, with power supplied temporarily by a water wheel. Under Bolton and Small's joint leadership, the new Soho plant would become the world's largest and most famous industrial facility. In February 1766, Franklin gave his famous testimony in Parliament against the notorious anti-American tax, the Stamp Act. He warned that the British Empire would be destroyed if it persisted in looting the colonies. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act on February 22, 1766, to the delight and applause of the world's Republicans. On that same historic day, Bolton wrote to Franklin from Birmingham asking for his comments on the steam engine, which Bolton and Small had built, a model of which he had sent to Franklin in London. Quote, "The addition you have made to my happiness in being the cause of my acquaintance with the amiable and ingenious Dr. Small deserves more than thanks. I introduce to you my good friend, Mr. Samuel Garbett, a zealous advocate for truth and for the rights of your oppressed countrymen. My engagements since Christmas have not permitted me to make any further progress with my fire engines, but as the thirsty season, that is the dry season when the water levels were too low for water wheels, is approaching apace, necessity will oblige me to set about it in good earnest. Query, which of the steam valves do you like best? Is it better to introduce the jet of cold water at the bottom of the receiver or at the top? Each has its advantages and disadvantages. My thoughts about the secondary or mechanical contrivances of the engine are too numerous to trouble you with in this letter, and yet I have not been lucky enough to hit upon any that are objectionless. If any thought occurs to your fertile genius, which you think may be useful, or preserve me from error in the execution of this engine, you'll be so kind as to communicate it to me." Erasmus Darwin wrote to Bolton on March 11, 1766, asking what Franklin had thought of the model steam engine and what he had suggested to improve it. Franklin replied to Bolton on March 19th, quote, "Excuse my so long omitting to answer your kind letter. Consider the excessive hurry and anxiety I have been engaged in with our American affairs. I know not which of the valves to give the preference to, nor whether it is best to introduce your jet of cold water above or below. Experiments will best decide in such cases. I would only repeat to you the hint I gave of fixing your grate in such a manner as to burn all your smoke. I think a great deal of fuel will then be saved for two reasons. One, that smoke is fuel and is wasted when it escapes uninflamed. The other, that it forms a sooty crust on the bottom of the boiler, which crust not being a good conductor of heat and preventing flame and hot air coming into immediate contact with the vessel, lessen their effect in giving heat to the water. All that is necessary is to make the smoke of fresh coals pass descending through those that are already thoroughly ignited. I sent the model last week with your papers in it, which I hope got safe to hand." Franklin here was addressing a central question in steam engineering. Certain primitive devices were already in use involving hot water vapor, such as the Newcomen engine, but only a tiny proportion of the energy in the fuel was translated into delivered power. This problem was to be solved definitively at Soho. The canal partners, meanwhile, pushed ahead. They at length prevailed in Parliament and were allowed to use the use of eminent domain to build south, completing the link from Manchester to Liverpool. The new law required toll-free shipment of road-building materials so that all national transport facilities could grow simultaneously. Bolton, the Gilberts, and Bridgewater now started canal projects all over England, and canal mania changed the face of the island. Britain converted at once to the use of coal from distant mines for fuel, instead of burning local stands of timber. The mass manufacture of iron and steel was now practicable. The Scottish mechanic engineer James Watt was employed in 1767 to survey for the Forth and Clyde Canal. He went to visit the Soho works and met there with the manager William Small. They talked of Watt's own recent experiments with steam power in Scotland. Dr. Small wrote to Watt on January 7, 1768, proposing the creation of a new firm. "You should settle here, and Bolton and I assist you as much as we could. I have no doubt of your success, nor of your acquiring fortune, if you proceed upon a proper plan as to the manner of doing business. I should not hesitate to employ any sum of money I can command on your scheme." While working as a scientific instrument maker for the faculty of Glasgow University, Watt had studied French, German, and Italian, and had applied himself zealously to the study of music. He learned to repair violins, guitars, and flutes. He studied harmonic theory, and in building first a model and then a full-scale organ, he devised new means of regulating its stops, tuning, and air pressure. Watt then studied the available French and Italian literature on steam research. He conducted rigorous experiments on gas dynamics. While repairing a broken Newcomen engine, he conceived the separate condenser, the eventual basis of a practical steam engine. He led the steam away from the main cylinder, liquefied it with a cold jet, reheated it, and brought it back into action while the cylinder could remain hot and do more work with less fuel. As a part of the negotiations to set up the world's first steam engine business, Small prepared a patent for Watt, which was tentatively approved on January 6, 1769. With constant encouragement by Dr. Small, Watt finally moved to Birmingham in 1774. The partnership of Small, Bolton, and Watt, under Small's patient and scientific management, pressed on and completed their first successful machine later that year. But Watt was often depressed and despondent. Over the years, his return to an active working role was several times revived by the pleas, threats, and rewards of Small and Bolton. The Soho Group invested perhaps £50,000 in the development, with no real profits until the 1780s, many years after the project began. The Soho steam engine became the driving force for the English Industrial Revolution, only after a final crucial improvement was made. At first, the piston was packed with stuffing material to close the gap with the cylinder wall and prevent the loss of steam pressure and force. The cast iron cylinder could never be shaped evenly enough for a tight fit around the piston. Bolton proposed to ironmaster John Wilkinson that his cannon boring machine tool be modified to produce an engine cylinder. Wilkinson's boring mill succeeded brilliantly, and Soho now made powerful, efficient steam engines, which Wilkinson used to run his furnace bellows and to turn his machines. Here was the birth of many industries at once. Wilkinson produced all the tools and machine parts for Soho, and Wilkinson and Bolton jointly launched modern English copper mining. Sadly, English high-efficiency steelmaking, its origin closely identified with Wilkinson, Watt, and the Franklin Republican Circle, would be used by the British Empire as an instrument of 19th century trade war against the American Republic. Well, I think I'm going to stop there. I got about 5 or 6 more pages in chapter 1. Interesting stuff about tracing all of the Industrial Revolution of England, which I've always thought of as England as the ones that started the Industrial Revolution, right? So the big point to take away is that no, it was the American ingenuity all along. It was Benjamin Franklin. It was the atmosphere at the College of William and Mary with William Small, also George Wythe, and the uh, the visit of Benjamin Franklin. The Scottish Enlightenment, of course, with James Watt, is part of it. But then again, a lot of what was happening in Scotland and what was happening in America was going together. You had the genius of these people, but also the combined genius that when different intelligent minds get together, they can solve a huge problem or create a whole new industry that, as we understand, can either be used for good or for ill. And while the people that created it intended to use it to lift up humanity, to take the quote from the book, the other people got a hold of it and used it to continue their enslavement and colonial oppression of the rest of the British Empire for as long as they possibly could. And that brings us up to today. So I'll leave it there for tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll see you at 11 o'clock for Minefields, and we'll probably talk a little bit about Ireland and the trip. Good night, everyone.